Staff Sergeant Maria Santos wiped the grease from her hands with a dirty rag, the familiar smell of engine oil and metal filling her nostrils. The forward operating base in Afghanistan was quiet except for the steady hum of generators and the occasional radio chatter from the command center. She had been working on the same Humvee engine for 3 hours, trying to coax life back into the temperamental diesel motor that kept the base's patrol vehicles running. "Santos, you done with that engine yet?" called out Corporal Jenkins from across the motor pool. "We need that truck ready for the morning patrol." Maria nodded without looking up from the engine bay. "Almost finished. The fuel injectors were clogged, but she'll run smooth now." Her voice carried the confidence of someone who knew machines better than most people knew themselves. She had been the base's head mechanic for 8 months, and in that time, not a single vehicle had stayed broken longer than necessary. The other soldiers at the base knew Maria as the quiet woman who could fix anything with wheels or an engine. She kept to herself mostly, worked long hours, and never complained about the heat, the dust, or the endless stream of broken equipment that found its way to her workshop. What they didn't know was that before she became a mechanic, Maria Santos had been one of the most lethal snipers in Marine Corps history. She had served 3 tours in Iraq as a designated marksman before a roadside bomb injured her left leg badly enough to end her infantry career. The doctors said she would walk with a slight limp for the rest of her life, and while that didn't disqualify her from military service entirely, it meant she couldn't meet the physical standards for frontline combat roles anymore. So she had retrained as a mechanic, finding a different way to serve her country and support her fellow soldiers. The irony wasn't lost on her. During her sniper days, she had accumulated 47 confirmed kills across 3 deployments. Her longest shot had been taken at 1,147 meters during a firefight in Fallujah, where she had eliminated an enemy machine gun position that was pinning down an entire Marine squad. The citation for her Silver Star was locked away in a file cabinet back home in Texas, along with commendations for valor and marksmanship that most soldiers only dreamed of receiving. But here at FOB Chapman, she was just the mechanic who kept the trucks running. "Santos!" The sharp voice of Captain Morrison cut through the evening air as he strode across the motor pool. Maria straightened up and wiped her hands again, noting the tension in the officer's voice. "Yes, sir. I need you to prep the backup Humvee for emergency deployment. We've got a situation developing." Morrison's face was grim, the kind of expression that meant trouble was brewing somewhere beyond the wire. Maria nodded and moved quickly to the vehicle bay, where the reserve Humvee sat waiting. It was her best-maintained vehicle, the one she kept in perfect condition for exactly this kind of emergency. As she checked the engine, transmission, and weapons mounts, she couldn't help but overhear the radio traffic coming from the command bunker nearby. "Tango 77, this is Overwatch." "Confirm your position," crackled the radio. The response was broken by static and what sounded like gunfire. "Overwatch. Tango 7, contact, heavy resistance, casualties." Maria's hands paused on the engine cover. Tango 77 was the call sign for the SEAL team that operated out of their base. She had worked on their vehicles many times, knew most of them by sight if not by name. They were good men, professionals who treated her with the same respect they showed their own teammates. Captain Morrison emerged from the command bunker, his face even more serious than before. "Santos, change of plans. That Humvee needs to be ready for immediate deployment, and I need you to drive it." "Sir?" Maria looked up, surprised. It wasn't unusual for mechanics to drive vehicles during emergencies, but something in Morrison's tone suggested this wasn't a routine supply run. "The SEAL team is pinned down 12 clicks north of here. Their vehicles were destroyed by an IED, and they've got wounded. We need to get a medical team to their location, but every available driver is already deployed on other missions." Morrison paused, studying Maria's face. "I know it's not your usual job, But you're the only one left who can handle a Humvee in rough terrain. Maria felt her pulse quicken slightly. Driving into a combat zone was far different from fixing engines in the relative safety of the base, but the thought of those SEALs trapped and wounded somewhere in the Afghan mountains made the decision easy. "I'll get them there, sir," she said simply. 20 minutes later, Maria was behind the wheel of the up-armored Humvee, following a dirt road that led north into the mountainous terrain where the SEAL team was trapped. In the passenger seat sat Doc Henderson, the base's senior medic, along with his full kit of medical supplies. In the back were 2 more medics and enough ammunition and equipment to sustain a small firefight if necessary. "How well do you know this area?" Doc Henderson asked as they bounced over a particularly rough section of road. "Well enough," Maria replied, downshifting to navigate around a cluster of boulders. "I've driven supply runs to the northern outposts before." She didn't mention that during her sniper days, she had memorized every ridge, valley, and potential shooting position in a 50-kilometer radius of their base. The radio crackled to life. "Medical 1, this is Overwatch. Be advised. Enemy activity has increased in your area. Multiple hostiles reported moving toward Tango 77's position." Doc Henderson keyed the radio. "Copy Overwatch. What's the ETA on backup?" "Medical 1, nearest available unit is 40 minutes out. Tango 77 may not have that long." Maria pressed harder on the accelerator. The Humvee's engine roared as they climbed a steep incline, dust billowing behind them in the fading afternoon light. She could hear the tension in the radio chatter, the controlled urgency that meant lives were hanging in the balance. "There," Doc Henderson pointed toward a ridgeline about 2 kilometers ahead. "That's where they're supposed to be." Through her window, Maria could see muzzle flashes flickering against the rocky slopes like deadly fireflies. The sound of gunfire carried across the distance, punctuated by the occasional boom of an explosion. Even from this distance, she could tell the firefight was intense. "Jesus," muttered one of the medics in the back. "Sounds like they're really getting hammered up there." Maria said nothing, but her hands tightened on the steering wheel. In her mind, she was already calculating distances, angles, and fields of fire. Old habits died hard, and the tactical part of her brain was automatically assessing the situation ahead. The road wound up through a narrow valley before reaching the ridge where the SEALs were trapped. It was perfect ambush terrain, with countless hiding places for enemy fighters and limited escape routes. As they drew closer, the sound of gunfire grew louder and more intense. "Medical 1, this is Tango 77, came a strained voice over the radio. "We've got 3 wounded and we're running low on ammo. How far out are you?" Doc Henderson grabbed the radio. "Tango 77, we're about 5 minutes from your position. Can you mark your location?" "Negative on the marking. Too much enemy activity. We're in a depression about 50 meters east of the burned-out truck. You'll see it when you get here." Maria could indeed see it now. The blackened skeleton of a destroyed vehicle sitting on a flat area of the ridge. Smoke was still rising from the wreckage, and she could see the muzzle flashes from the SEAL team's position nearby. But she could also see something that made her blood run cold. "Doc, we've got a problem," she said quietly, pointing toward the slope above the SEAL position. "Look at those muzzle flashes. They're not just under attack, they're surrounded." Henderson followed her gaze and cursed under his breath. Enemy fighters had positioned themselves on 3 sides of the SEAL team's position, using the rocky terrain for cover while they poured fire down into the depression where the SEALs had taken shelter. It was a classic encirclement, and from what Maria could see, the enemy had at least 20 or 30 fighters in position. "Overwatch, this is Medical 1, Henderson called on the radio. "Enemy has Tango 77 surrounded. We're going to need immediate air support or artillery to clear a path." "Medical 1, no air assets available. Artillery is offline due to mechanical issues. You'll have to find another way to reach them." Maria's mind was racing. The road they were on led directly into the kill zone, where the Humvee would be an easy target for enemy rockets and machine guns. There was no way they could drive straight in without getting everyone killed. But she knew these mountains, knew the terrain from her sniper days when she had spent weeks at a time studying every rock and ravine through her scope. "Doc, I know another way," she said suddenly. "There's an old goat path that leads up the backside of that ridge. It's rough, but we might be able to get close enough for you to reach them on foot." Henderson looked at her with surprise. "How do you know about a goat path?" "I pay attention to the terrain," Maria said simply. It was the truth, even if it wasn't the whole truth. She turned the Humvee off the main road and onto what looked like nothing more than a faint track winding up through the rocks. The vehicle lurched and bounced as they climbed, the engine straining against the steep grade. Behind them, the sound of gunfire continued to echo off the mountainsides. The path was even rougher than Maria remembered, forcing her to drive at little more than walking speed to avoid damaging the vehicle or throwing her passengers around too badly. But it was taking them where they needed to go, around the backside of the ridge, away from the main enemy positions. After 20 minutes of careful driving, they reached a point where the path leveled out about 300 meters from where the SEAL team was trapped. Maria stopped the Humvee behind a cluster of large boulders that would provide some protection from enemy fire. "This is as close as I can get you," she told Henderson. "From here, it's about a 2-minute sprint to reach them." Doc Henderson studied the terrain ahead. Between their position and the SEALs, the ground was relatively open with only scattered rocks for cover. Enemy muzzle flashes were still visible on the slopes above, and stray bullets occasionally whined overhead. "It's going to be dangerous," Henderson said, "but it looks like our best shot." He turned to the other medics. "You boys ready for this?" The two younger medics nodded, though Maria could see the fear in their eyes. They were brave men, but they weren't combat soldiers. Running across open ground under enemy fire was not something they had trained for extensively. "I'll cover you," Maria said, checking the M240 machine gun mounted on the Humvee's roof. Henderson looked at her with confusion. "Cover us? Santos, you're a mechanic." Maria met his gaze steadily. "I know how to use a machine gun, Doc. Get your men ready." She climbed up into the gunner's position and began checking the weapon's condition. The M240 was clean and well-maintained. She made sure all the weapons on base were kept in perfect working order, even though she wasn't supposed to have much reason to use them herself. Through the gun sight, she could see the SEAL team's position clearly. They were indeed trapped in a rocky depression with at least 3 wounded men visible. Enemy fighters were firing from positions scattered across the ridgeline above, using the high ground to their advantage. "Medical team is ready to move," Henderson called from below. Maria studied the enemy positions through her scope. There were too many of them, and they had too much cover. Even with the machine gun, she couldn't suppress all of them effectively enough to guarantee safe passage for the medics. They needed a better plan. "Doc, wait," she called down. "I'm seeing at least 15 enemy positions up there. The machine gun won't be enough to keep them all pinned down while you cross." Henderson climbed back into the Humvee. "Then what do you suggest? Those SEALs don't have much time." Maria was quiet for a moment, thinking. In her mind, she was calculating ranges, wind conditions, and target priorities. It was the same mental process she had used dozens of times during her sniper deployments, and the solution was obvious to her. She just wasn't sure she could explain it without revealing more about her background than she wanted to. "There's another option," she said finally. "But you're not going to like it." The radio crackled again. "Medical 1, this is Tango 7-7. Enemy is massing for another assault. We need that medical support now." Maria looked at Doc Henderson, then at the 2 young medics who were depending on her to get them safely to their patients. The weight of responsibility was familiar, even if the circumstances were different from her sniper days. "Doc, I need you to trust me," she said. "Can you handle basic vehicle maintenance?" Henderson looked confused. "What does that have to do with anything?" Because someone needs to stay with the Humvee, and I'm going to need to move on foot. Maria began checking her personal weapon, an M4 rifle that she kept immaculately maintained. Those enemy positions need to be eliminated before anyone can safely cross that open ground. Santos, you're talking about taking on 15 armed fighters by yourself. That's insane. Maria shouldered her rifle and checked her ammunition. She had 6 30-round magazines plus her sidearm. It wasn't a lot for what she was planning, but it would have to be enough. Not by myself, she said. The SEALs are still fighting. I'm just going to even the odds a little. Before Henderson could object further, Maria had climbed out of the Humvee and begun moving toward the ridgeline. The familiar weight of her rifle felt comfortable in her hands, and despite the months of working as a mechanic, her body automatically fell back into the silent, efficient movement patterns of a trained sniper. Behind her, she heard Henderson curse creatively as he realized she was serious about her plan. But there wasn't time for arguments. Through the gunfire ahead, she could hear the voices of wounded men calling for help. Maria moved through the rocky terrain with the fluid grace of someone who had spent years perfecting the art of invisible movement. Each step was carefully placed to avoid loose stones that might clatter and give away her position. Her breathing was controlled and quiet, her rifle held at the ready but not interfering with her movement. The sound of gunfire grew louder as she approached the ridgeline where the enemy fighters had positioned themselves. Through breaks in the rock formations, she could see muzzle flashes from at least a dozen different positions. The enemy had chosen their spots well, using natural rock formations and scraggly bushes for concealment while maintaining clear fields of fire down into the depression where the SEALs were trapped. Maria reached a position about 200 meters from the nearest enemy fighter and carefully lowered herself behind a large boulder. From here, she could observe the entire battlefield and begin planning her attack. Old habits from her sniper days took over automatically, and she began cataloging targets, ranges, and priorities. The enemy fighters were spread across roughly 300 meters of ridgeline, positioned in groups of 2 or 3. Most appeared to be armed with AK-47 assault rifles, though she could see at least 2 machine gun positions and what looked like an RPG team setting up for another rocket attack on the SEAL position. Through her rifle scope, Maria studied the faces of the enemy fighters. They were confident, even relaxed, clearly believing they had their targets trapped with no hope of rescue. Several were talking casually between bursts of gunfire, and she could see one group sharing what looked like bread and water. They thought this fight was already won. They were about to learn otherwise. Maria selected her first target carefully. The machine gun position on the left flank was doing the most damage to the SEALs, keeping them pinned down with sustained bursts of automatic fire. 2 fighters were operating the weapon, with one feeding ammunition while the other aimed and fired. She adjusted her rifle scope for the range, 247 meters, and accounted for the slight crosswind coming from the east. The target was partially concealed behind rocks, but she had a clear shot at the gunner's center mass. Maria controlled her breathing, let out half a breath, and gently squeezed the trigger. The rifle cracked sharply, and the enemy machine gunner dropped immediately. His partner looked around in confusion for a moment before Maria's second shot took him down as well. The machine gun fell silent. The other enemy fighters began shouting in alarm, but they hadn't yet figured out where the shots were coming from. Maria was already moving to a new position, using the confusion to close the distance to her next target. A group of 3 fighters had taken cover behind a cluster of boulders about 180 meters away. They were gesturing wildly and trying to locate the source of the gunfire that had eliminated their machine gun team. Maria settled into a prone position behind a fallen log and lined up her shot on the fighter, who appeared to be giving orders to the others. The first shot took down their leader. As his companions scrambled for better cover, Maria's follow-up shots dropped them both before they could reach safety. The entire engagement had taken less than 15 seconds. Down in the depression, the SEALs had noticed the change in the battle rhythm. The enemy fire was becoming less coordinated, and several of their tormentors had mysteriously stopped shooting altogether. Through the radio chatter, Maria could hear the SEAL team leader trying to figure out what was happening. "Tango 77, this is Medical 1, came Doc Henderson's voice over the radio. "We have a friendly asset working to clear your flanks. Stand by for further instructions." Maria almost smiled at Henderson's careful phrasing. Friendly asset was certainly one way to describe what she was doing. Her next target was the RPG team she had spotted earlier. 2 fighters were setting up the rocket launcher, while a third stood watch. They were positioned behind a low stone wall about 220 meters away, and Maria could see they were almost ready to fire another rocket at the trapped SEALs. This shot would be more difficult. The wind had picked up slightly, and her target was partially concealed behind the stone wall. But Maria had made much harder shots during her combat deployments, often under far worse conditions. She adjusted her scope, calculated the ballistics, and waited for the perfect moment. When the RPG operator raised his head to sight his weapon, Maria was ready. Her shot took him down instantly, and the rocket launcher clattered harmlessly against the rocks. The man's 2 companions immediately began scanning the hills, trying to locate the sniper who was picking off their friends one by one. They were starting to panic, and panicked enemies made mistakes. One of them exposed himself too much while trying to get a better view of the surrounding terrain, and Maria punished the error with a clean headshot at 198 meters. The remaining fighter from the RPG team decided discretion was the better part of valor and began crawling away from his position, staying low behind the rocks. Maria tracked his movement patiently through her scope, waiting for him to make another mistake. When he finally raised his head to check if the coast was clear, she was ready. 8 down, at least 7 to go. The surviving enemy fighters were beginning to realize they were under attack from a skilled marksman, and their behavior changed accordingly. They stopped exposing themselves unnecessarily and began trying to coordinate their movements to locate and eliminate the threat. But they were making a fundamental error in their tactical thinking. They assumed they were dealing with a single sniper operating from a fixed position, the kind of threat they had been trained to handle. They began focusing their attention on likely sniper hides, trying to spot muzzle flashes or other signs that would give away their tormentor's location. What they didn't understand was that Maria wasn't fighting like a traditional sniper. Instead, she was using techniques she had learned during urban combat operations, constantly moving and engaging targets from unexpected positions. She was fighting more like an extremely skilled infantryman than like a long-range marksman. Maria had already moved 3 times since beginning her attack, and she was preparing to relocate again when she spotted movement among the rocks to her right. 2 enemy fighters were trying to flank her position, moving carefully from boulder to boulder in an attempt to get behind her. She waited until they were both exposed and took them down with quick shots at close range. Their bodies tumbled down the slope, and the sound of their equipment clattering against the rocks echoed across the battlefield. 10 down, approximately 5 to go. The remaining enemy fighters were getting desperate. They knew they were being hunted by someone with exceptional skills, and their confident assault on the trapped SEALs had turned into a nightmare. Some began to break and run, abandoning their positions and trying to escape down the backside of the ridge. Maria let them go. Her mission was to rescue the SEALs, not to pursue fleeing enemies into terrain where they might have support waiting, but she made sure to remember their faces and the direction they had taken in case they tried to circle back later. 3 fighters remained in defensive positions, clearly determined to hold their ground despite the losses they had suffered. They had good cover and were maintaining discipline, making them more dangerous than the panicked fighters who had fled. Maria studied their positions carefully. They were spread out across about 50 meters of ridgeline, each behind solid rock cover that would be difficult to penetrate with rifle fire. These men were veterans, and they weren't going to make the same mistakes their dead comrades had made. But Maria had an advantage they didn't know about. During her sniper deployments, she had spent months learning to read terrain and predict enemy behavior. She knew that confident, well-trained fighters often fell into predictable patterns when under pressure. Sure enough, after several minutes of silence, one of the remaining fighters began to grow impatient. He started exposing himself slightly, trying to get a better view of the area where he thought the sniper might be hiding. Maria waited until his curiosity overcame his caution, then put a bullet through his chest when he leaned out too far from behind his rock shelter. 11 down, 2 to go. The last two fighters were smart enough to learn from their companion's fatal mistake. They stayed in solid cover and didn't expose themselves unnecessarily. But they made a different error. They started talking to each other, coordinating their movements with hand signals and whispered conversations. Maria used their communication against them. By listening carefully to their voices and watching their gestures, she was able to predict their movements and position herself accordingly. When one of them finally moved to get a better angle on what he thought was her position, Maria was waiting with a perfect shot. One left. The final enemy fighter was either very brave or very stupid. Instead of fleeing like his smarter companions, he began moving aggressively toward Maria's last known position, apparently determined to take out the sniper who had decimated his unit. Maria had to admire his courage, even as she prepared to kill him. This man was a warrior, someone who refused to abandon his mission even when facing impossible odds. Under different circumstances, she might have respected him. But today he was threatening the lives of American servicemen, and that made him her enemy. She let him come closer, moving from rock to rock as he tried to hunt her down. When he was about 70 meters away, she showed herself briefly, just long enough for him to spot her and start moving in her direction. Then she quickly relocated to a position behind him and waited. When the fighter reached the spot where he had seen her, Maria was already behind him with her rifle trained on his back. She could have called for him to surrender, but that would have given him a chance to use the grenade she could see clipped to his vest, potentially endangering the SEALs below. Her final shot of the engagement was taken at close range, and it ended the threat permanently. 12 confirmed kills. The ridgeline was finally quiet. Tango 7-7, this is Medical 1. Doc Henderson's voice came over the radio. The flanks appear to be clear. Medical team is moving to your position now. From her elevated position on the ridge, Maria could see Henderson and his two medics beginning their sprint across the open ground toward the SEAL team's position. Without the enemy machine gun and rifles firing down at them, the crossing was much safer, though still dangerous. She kept her rifle trained on the surrounding area, watching for any signs of returning enemy fighters or reinforcements. But the mountains remained quiet, except for the sound of the medics reaching their patients. Medical 1, this is Tango 7-7 leader, came a new voice over the radio. We have you in sight. Thanks for the assist with those tangos on the ridge. That was some impressive shooting. Maria smiled slightly. The SEAL team leader sounded professional but curious, clearly wondering who had eliminated an entire enemy squad with such efficiency. Medical 1 copies, Henderson responded. Glad we could help. What's your status on casualties? 3 wounded, 2 serious but stable. We're going to need medical evacuation as soon as possible. Maria began making her way down the ridge toward the Humvee, moving carefully to avoid silhouetting herself against the sky. The immediate threat was over, but they still needed to get everyone safely back to base, and there was always the possibility that enemy reinforcements were on the way. As she walked, she mentally reviewed her ammunition expenditure. 12 rounds fired, 12 confirmed kills. It wasn't her most efficient engagement. During her sniper days, she had once eliminated 8 targets with 8 rounds at much longer range. But the circumstances had been different. Today, she had been fighting at closer range, moving constantly, and operating under time pressure. When Maria reached the Humvee, Henderson was monitoring the radio and coordinating with the base for helicopter evacuation of the wounded SEALs. He looked up when she approached, and she could see a mixture of respect and confusion in his expression. "Santos," he said quietly, "I don't suppose you want to explain how a mechanic just eliminated an entire enemy squad with a rifle?" Maria began cleaning her weapon, checking the barrel and action for any signs of fouling from the extended engagement. "I'm a good shot," she said simply. Henderson studied her face for a moment, clearly wanting to ask more questions, but apparently deciding this wasn't the time or place. "Well, whatever your background, those SEALs owe you their lives." "That was the most professional piece of marksmanship I've ever seen." "The medics did the important work," Maria replied, deflecting the praise. "I just cleared the way." Over the radio, they could hear the approaching sound of helicopters coming to evacuate the wounded. The rescue mission was almost complete, and everyone was going to make it home safely. But Maria knew this was just the beginning of what would become a much larger problem for her. The helicopters arrived 20 minutes later, their rotors churning up clouds of dust as they settled onto the rocky ground near the SEAL team's position. Maria watched through binoculars from the Humvee as the medical crew efficiently loaded the 3 wounded operators onto stretchers and prepared them for transport to the field hospital. Chief Petty Officer Jake Reynolds, the SEAL team leader, approached the Humvee as his wounded teammates were being evacuated. He was a lean, weathered man in his 30s, with the kind of intense eyes that came from years of combat operations. His uniform was torn and dusty, and Maria could see dried blood on his sleeve from where shrapnel had grazed him during the firefight. "Which one of you is the shooter?" Reynolds asked, looking between Maria and Doc Henderson. Henderson nodded toward Maria, who was checking the engine oil level and trying to look as inconspicuous as possible. "That would be Staff Sergeant Santos." Reynolds studied Maria with the calculating gaze of a professional warrior assessing another professional. "Santos, I counted at least 12 separate shots during that engagement. How many targets did you eliminate?" 12, Maria replied simply, not looking up from the engine bay. 12 shots, 12 kills? Reynolds' voice carried a note of disbelief. "At what ranges?" "Between 70 and 250 meters, depending on the target." Reynolds was quiet for a moment, clearly processing this information. As a SEAL, he was familiar with exceptional marksmanship, but what Maria had accomplished was beyond what most infantry soldiers could achieve, even under ideal conditions. "Santos, what's your primary MOS?" he asked, using the military acronym for job classification. "Motor transport mechanic," Maria answered. "Your primary MOS," Reynolds repeated with emphasis. "What were you before you turned wrenches?" Maria finally looked up from the engine, meeting his steady gaze. She could see that he wasn't going to let this drop, and she realized that trying to maintain her cover as just a mechanic was no longer realistic. "Marine Corps designated marksman. 3 tours in Iraq," she said quietly. Reynolds nodded slowly, as if pieces of a puzzle were falling into place. "That explains it. What unit?" "3rd Battalion, 4th Marines." "No shit. You're Maria Santos?" Reynolds' entire demeanor changed, taking on the respectful tone of one elite soldier recognizing another. "You're the Santos who took out that machine gun nest in Fallujah at over 1,200 meters." Maria felt her stomach tighten. Her reputation had apparently traveled further than she had hoped. "That was a long time ago." "Not that long," Reynolds said. "I was there that day. Different unit, but same sector. That was the shot that broke the back of the insurgent attack on the government building. My squad was pinned down 2 blocks away, and when that machine gun went silent, we were able to advance and rescue a dozen Iraqi civilians." Doc Henderson was staring at Maria with his mouth slightly open. "Santos, you never mentioned any of this." "It's not relevant to fixing engines," Maria said. but she knew even as she said it that everything had changed. Word would spread, and soon everyone on base would know that the quiet mechanic was actually one of the most decorated marksmen in Marine Corps history. "The hell it isn't relevant," Reynolds said. "Santos, my team owes you their lives. If you hadn't taken out those fighters on the ridge, we wouldn't have lasted another hour." He paused, studying her face. "But I'm guessing you don't want this story getting around." Maria looked at him with surprise. Most soldiers would be eager to spread news about a heroic rescue, especially one involving such impressive marksmanship. "Why would you say that?" Reynolds smiled grimly. "Because you've been hiding your background for a reason, and good soldiers don't blow each other's cover without permission." He gestured toward the helicopters, which were beginning to lift off with the wounded SEALs. "But I'm afraid this story isn't going to stay quiet. Too many people saw what happened today." As if to confirm his words, Captain Morrison's voice crackled over the radio. "Medical 1, this is Overwatch. What's your status? We're getting reports of significant enemy casualties in your area." Doc Henderson keyed the radio. "Overwatch, Medical 1. Mission successful, casualties evacuated. We had assistance from an extremely skilled marksman." "Copy that. Who was your marksman? We didn't have any sniper teams deployed in your sector." Henderson looked at Maria, who shrugged resignedly. There was no point in trying to hide it any longer. "Overwatch marksman was Staff Sergeant Santos from Motorpool." There was a long pause before Morrison's voice came back, sounding confused. "Medical 1, did you say Santos? The mechanic?" "Affirmative, sir. Staff Sergeant Santos eliminated 12 enemy fighters during the rescue operation." Another pause. "Medical 1, return to base immediately. All personnel report to debriefing upon arrival." The drive back to Fob Chapman was quiet, each person lost in their own thoughts. Doc Henderson kept glancing at Maria as if seeing her for the first time, while she focused on the road ahead and tried to prepare herself for what was coming. When they reached the base, word of the rescue had already spread. Soldiers who had never paid much attention to the quiet mechanic were now watching her with curiosity and respect as she parked the Humvee and began her post-mission vehicle inspection. Captain Morrison was waiting for them at the motor pool, along with Major Sarah Collins, the base intelligence officer. Maria had seen Collins around, but had never spoken with her directly. The major was a sharp-eyed woman in her 40s who had the reputation of someone who didn't miss any details. "Staff Sergeant Santos," Morrison said formally, "report to my office for debriefing in 10 minutes. "Yes, sir," Maria replied, continuing her inspection of the Humvee. Old habits died hard, and she wasn't about to skip proper equipment maintenance just because everyone wanted to talk about what had happened on the ridge. 10 minutes later, Maria sat in Morrison's office facing the captain, Major Collins, and a laptop computer displaying what appeared to be her complete military personnel file. Collins was scrolling through pages of commendations, training records, and operational reports. "Staff Sergeant Santos," Collins began, "your official records show 47 confirmed kills across 3 combat deployments, along with a Silver Star, 2 Bronze Stars, and a Navy Achievement Medal for Valor. You're also qualified as an instructor in advanced marksmanship and small unit tactics." "Yes, ma'am." "And yet your current assignment has you working as a motor transport mechanic at a forward operating base in Afghanistan." Collins looked up from the laptop. "Care to explain that career trajectory?" Maria had been dreading this conversation for months. "I was injured by an IED during my 3rd deployment. Left leg, multiple fractures. The injury disqualified me from infantry duties, so I retrained in motor transport. The medical records show you were cleared for limited duty after 6 months of rehabilitation," Morrison added. "You could have requested assignment to a training unit stateside or taken a position with headquarters staff. Why did you volunteer for deployment to Afghanistan as a mechanic?" Maria was quiet for a moment, trying to find words for feelings she hadn't really examined herself. "Sir, my teammates were still deployed. I wanted to find a way to keep supporting them, even if I couldn't carry a rifle anymore." Collins and Morrison exchanged a look. "Sergeant, what you accomplished today suggests you can still carry a rifle quite effectively," Collins said. "Ma'am, I'm not qualified for combat operations anymore. My leg injury affects my mobility, and I can't meet the physical fitness standards for infantry assignments." "Your leg injury didn't seem to affect your performance today," Morrison observed. "According to Chief Reynolds' initial report, you moved across several hundred meters of rough terrain while engaging multiple targets with precision fire. That doesn't sound like someone who's physically disqualified for combat duties." Maria realized they were building up to something, but she wasn't sure what. "Sir, I was motivated by the situation. Adrenaline probably helped with the pain." Major Collins closed the laptop and leaned forward. "Staff Sergeant Santos, I'm going to be direct with you. Your actions today likely saved the lives of 6 American servicemen. But they also revealed that we have one of the most skilled marksmen in the Marine Corps working as a mechanic when we desperately need qualified instructors and operational personnel." "What are you saying, ma'am?" "I'm saying we want to discuss reassignment possibilities," Morrison interjected. "There are several positions that could make better use of your specialized skills while accommodating your medical limitations." Maria felt a familiar mix of hope and fear. She had missed the sense of purpose that came with using her skills to protect other soldiers, but she had also accepted that those days were over. "What kind of positions, sir?" "Sniper instructor at the Army Marksmanship Unit," Collins said. "Training position at Scout Sniper School. Tactical advisor for Special Operations Units. All positions that would utilize your expertise while keeping you out of direct combat operations. There's also a possibility of limited operational deployment with Special Forces units," Morrison added. "Situations where your marksmanship skills could provide overwatch and support for teams like the one you rescued today." Maria thought about the satisfaction she had felt while eliminating the threats to the SEAL team, the sense of rightness that came from using her abilities to protect fellow soldiers. It was a feeling she had missed more than she had admitted to herself. "I'd need to think about it," she said finally. "Of course," Collins replied. "But I want you to know that today's action is going to generate significant attention. Word is already spreading about what happened on that ridge. And it won't be long before higher headquarters starts asking questions about why someone with your capabilities is changing oil filters instead of training the next generation of snipers." As if to prove her point, Morrison's radio crackled to life. "Chapman Base, this is Regiment. We need a complete after-action report on today's rescue operation, with particular emphasis on the marksmanship performance of Staff Sergeant Santos." Morrison keyed the radio. "Copy, Regiment. Report will be submitted within 24 hours. Chapman Base, be advised that General Patterson wants to speak directly with Staff Sergeant Santos via video conference at 800 tomorrow." Maria felt her eyes widen. General Patterson was the commanding general of all Marine forces in Afghanistan, a 3-star general who didn't normally concern himself with the actions of individual staff sergeants. "Copy, Regiment. Santos will be available for video conference as requested." After Morrison signed off, the room was quiet for several moments. Finally, Collins spoke. "Sergeant, I think it's safe to say your days as an anonymous mechanic are over," she said with a slight smile. "The question now is what you want to do with the attention you're about to receive." Maria looked out the window of Morrison's office toward the motor pool, where she had spent the last 8 months in comfortable obscurity. Several soldiers were gathered around the Humvee she had driven on the rescue mission, probably examining it for bullet holes or other signs of the action it had seen. "Ma'am, if I accept reassignment, what happens to the motor pool here? I'm the only qualified mechanic on base." Morrison looked surprised by her question. "Santos, that's not your responsibility anymore. We'll get a replacement." "Sir, respectfully, these vehicles keep everyone on this base alive. The replacement needs to be someone who understands that every bolt and wire might mean the difference between soldiers coming home and them getting killed because their truck broke down at the wrong moment." Collins nodded approvingly. That's exactly the kind of attention to detail and sense of responsibility we need in our training programs. Santos, you could teach that mindset to hundreds of Marines over the course of a career. Maria realized that her choice was already made, even if she hadn't consciously admitted it yet. The satisfaction she had felt during the rescue operation had reminded her of why she had become a Marine in the first place, and hiding her abilities in a motor pool wasn't serving anyone. "Ma'am, if I accept reassignment, I have one condition." "What's that?" "I want to finish training my replacement here before I transfer. These soldiers deserve someone who will take care of their equipment the right way." Collins smiled. "I think that can be arranged. Welcome back to the fight, Staff Sergeant Santos." 2 weeks later, Maria was packing her personal gear for transfer to Camp Pendleton, where she would begin her new assignment as a senior instructor at Scout Sniper School. Her replacement, Sergeant Tommy Walsh, was a competent young mechanic who had spent the past weeks absorbing everything Maria could teach him about maintaining vehicles in a combat environment. The entire base had turned out to see her off, including Chief Reynolds and 2 of the SEALs she had helped rescue. They were fully recovered from their wounds and preparing to return to operations. "Santos," Reynolds said as she loaded her duffel bag into the helicopter that would take her to the airfield, "I wanted you to have this." He handed her a small metal object, a trident pin, the insignia of the Navy SEALs. "Chief, I can't accept this. I'm not a SEAL." "No, but you fought like one when it mattered," Reynolds replied. "This is from the whole team. We wanted you to know that you'll always be welcome among us." As the helicopter lifted off and FOB Chapman fell away beneath her, Maria reflected on how much had changed since that afternoon when she had simply been trying to fix a broken Humvee engine. The story of the mechanic who had eliminated 40 enemy fighters to rescue a SEAL team had already become legend throughout the Marine Corps, growing in the telling until she barely recognized herself in the versions she heard. But the core truth remained simple. When her fellow soldiers had been in danger, she had used every skill and resource at her disposal to bring them home safely. That was what being a Marine meant, whether you were carrying a rifle in combat or turning wrenches in a motor pool. And now she would have the chance to teach that lesson to the next generation of warriors, ensuring that her knowledge and experience would live on in the soldiers she trained. It was a good way to serve, and perhaps the best possible outcome from a day that had started with nothing more ambitious than fixing a broken engine. The helicopter banked toward the east, carrying Maria Santos toward her new life as one of the most respected marksmanship instructors in the United States Marine Corps. Behind her, the mountains of Afghanistan faded into the distance, but the lessons learned on those rocky ridges would stay with her forever.